A seam is a method of binding two or more pieces of fabric together, usually using thread to form stitches. However, glue and other forms of adhesives can also be used. Seams can be stitched by hand or sewn by machine. Seams can be either open or be closed. An open seam is one where the seam allowance, the piece of fabric between the edge of the material and the stitches, is visible. A closed seam incorporates the seam allowance within the seam finish, making it invisible. Now let's see the construction procedure for different types of seams. In this experiment, we'll be seeing 10 different types of seams: plain seam, single top stitched seam, double top stitched seam, welt seam, lap seam, French seam, slot seam, bound seam, piped seam, and contrast seam. First, let's see the construction procedure for plain seam. For the construction of plain seam, we need two fabric pieces of 7 by 3 inches length into breadth measurement. Then place one fabric over the another and then mark a line 1 inch from one of its edges. Once the line is drawn, make a stitch through that line. Start with back tacking at the top and complete a top stitch throughout the line, and then end with another back tacking so that we can secure the stitches at both the edges. And that completes the plain seam. Next is single top stitched seam. For the construction of single top stitched seam, first construct a plain seam and then mark a line about 0.5 inch from the plain seam and then stitch a top stitch through that line. And this is how the single top stitched seam looks like once after it's completed. Next is double top stitched seam. For the construction of double top stitched seam, first make a plain seam and keep the seam allowances open on the top of plain seam, just like shown in the figure. And once this seam allowances are kept open, mark a line about 0.5 inch from the seam, a plain seam line on both sides of the seam allowance. And this is how double top stitch seam look like once it is completed. Next, we'll see about lap seam. Prepare two pieces of fabric of 3 by 7 inch dimensions. Then place the first fabric with the right side on the top and put the second fabric on the top of the first one by keeping right side together. Open and fold the second fabric like this. So the folding distance to the seam allowance edge is about 2 cm. And then sew along the stitch line by leaving 0.5 cm from the fold line like this. This is how the lap seam look like once it is done. Next is the making of welt seam. First, for the construction of welt seam, make a plain seam and then trim one of the seam allowances to about half. Now press the other seam allowance to one side so that it will cover the shoulder piece with the seam allowances and press it. Next, just make a top stitch by keeping an equal distance from the original stitching or plain stitch line and stitch the fold in place. And that's what welt seam is. Next is the construction procedure for French seam. For the construction of French seam also, first we have to make a plain seam. Once the plain seam is made, we have to trim down the seam allowance about 0.5 inches or 5 centimeters from the seam line. So we have to first mark the line through which we are going to trim down. And then we have to cut both the seam allowances, keeping together. So for just like what we did for welt, we have to follow the same procedure. The only difference is in welt we only trim down one of the seam allowances. Here we have to trim both the seam allowances. And then we have to turn both the seams together from one side to the other. Then we have to fold it like this and make a crease. And we have to make a stitch next to the trimmed edges over the top of the fabric. And that gives the front seam. It will look like this from outside, and the inside portion, if we turn it over, we can see there will not be any frayed edges. So that much close we have to make the top stitch. So next we will see the construction procedure for bound seam. For the construction of bound seam, we have to first make a plain seam. Once the plain seam is done, we have to split open the seam allowances of plain seam. Now take two pieces of different colored fabric of 7 by 1.5 inch dimension to bind the edges. Now take one of the side of the seam allowance made by a plain seam and take one of the fabric pieces we have cut down and place it over the side seam of plain seam like this. And we have to sew them together. Start the stitch using a back tacking and similarly end the stitch using a back tacking. Now we have to take out the fabric, and if there is any extra edges we have to cut it down, and we have to fold the other side of the piece that we have attached, that is the green colored cloth. We have to fold one of its edges like this. So here the first fold is made, and again just crease it, and then again after that we have to once again fold it by covering the seam allowances just made now, so that the edges will not be visible. So we have to make a proper binding to the edge that we have made. So it will look like this, and we have to make a top stitch over the folding just next to the end line. If we finish both the side seam edges, then the seam will be like this. Next we will see the construction procedure for piped seam. For the construction of piped seam, we need 3 fabric pieces, 2 of 7 by 3 inch dimension and 1 of 7 by 1 inch dimension, and the single piece is always considered to be of different color, so that it will give a good or better appearance. Now take the 7 by 1 inch fabric and fold it from the center, and close to the folding that is by the center we have to make a stitch. So this fabric will be coming as the piping. After folding and stitching, take out the fabric and take the other 2 fabrics also, that is 7 by 3 inch fabric. So place this 7 by 1 inch fabric, which is folded and stitched from its center, over one side of the 7 by 3 inch fabric, and place the other over the both in such a way that it is sandwiched between the right side of 7 by 3 inch fabric. Now keeping all 3 together, we have to make a stitch close to the first stitch we made, that is to the piping stitch, the piping side. Start with back tacking and also end with back tacking. While stitching, we have to make sure that the stitches are coming even, so that the piping will be on correct or proper position. And that's what is piped seam. Next, we'll see the construction procedure of slot seam. For the construction of slot seam also, we require 3 fabrics. So 2 fabrics should be of dimension 7 by 3 inch and 1 should be of dimension 7 by 2 inch. First, take the 7 by 2 inch fabric and keep it aside. And then take the base fabric, that is 7 by 3 inches fabric, and fold it about half an inch at one of its edges, and place it over the 7 by 2 inch fabric in such a way that it will align at the center of that 7 by 2 inch fabric, and we have to make a top stitch over that. So place it over 7/2 inch fabric in such a way that the face side of the base fabric will be facing upwards. Start with back tacking and straight stitch, make a straight stitch, and also end with another back tacking and take out the fabric. So here the stitch formation will be like this. So this completes one side, and for the other side we have to do the same procedure. So we have to take the other base fabric and we have to fold about 5 inch on one of its edges, so that its face side will be facing upwards, and we have to keep it we have to align it close to the stitch that we have already made. So the base fabric, that is the two base fabrics, will be sewn together by a line of 7/2 inch dimension fabric should be seen. We can vary the arrangement according to the design what we prefer. So here I prefer not to see that much, just a line will be enough for me. So that's why I'm stitching like this. Whatever be the dimension, whatever be the design we require, we can modify according to that. And that completes our slot stitch. So if we split open the edges, we can see the fabric inside. So this is a narrow design of slot seam. Next and the last one is contrast seam. So we will see the construction procedure for contrast seam. For the construction of contrast seam, we require 4 fabric pieces, 2 base fabric and 2 of contrast fabric. Here I have taken brown colored fabric as shown in figure, and the second image shows the arrangement of base fabric and contrast fabric. We have to arrange in such a way that the base fabric should be in open form, and we have to fold the contrast fabric from its center and place it above the base fabric as given in image. For the construction of a contrast seam, first take the base fabric and one contrast fabric, and we have to fold the contrast fabrics from its center, so that we will get the line through which we have to stitch, and we have to place it over the base fabric. So we got the center line and we have to mark through the center line so that we can correctly stitch on the top of the center line. So once this is done, we have to make a top stitch through the center part, through the line which we have made. So before stitching, during stitching, we have to start with back tacking and also make sure that we are ending with back tacking. And yes, this completes one side of the contrast seam. We have to trim off the extra thread and we have to fold the contrast fabric from its center through the line, stitch line which we have made like this. If we need, we can press it so that it will be in the position. So this makes the first half of contrast seam. Now we have to do the same for the second half. Now both the sides are made. Now we have to join them together so that we will get a complete contrast stitch. So align the fabric like this. Take the two halves and align it one over the another. So just like this we have to align. Make sure that we have to align in such a way that the center line, stitch line, will be in a correct manner. So the top and bottom portion of both the fabrics, both sides, should align in a straight line. If we need, we can pin it using ball pins so that it will not move from the position. And after aligning, we have to make a top stitch over the both sandwich fabrics by leaving about 0.5 inch from the center line. Here also start with back tacking and end with back tacking. And that completes the contrast seam. We have to trim off the extra thread, and this is how it looks like once it is done. So when we open it, we will get the contrast effect, contrast seam. So with this, we are done with the top 10 basic seams and its construction procedure. Thank you for watching.